In 1995, there were somewhere between 20 and 30 Florida panthers left on the entire planet. Not hundreds, not a comfortable breeding population tucked away in some protected reserve. 20 to 30 animals, spread across the swamps and pine flatwoods of South Florida, slowly dying from the inside out. And when scientists say dying from the inside out, they mean it literally. The panthers had been inbreeding for so long that their bodies were falling apart. Males had undescended testicles at a rate of nearly 90%. Their sperm was so deformed that reproduction was becoming almost impossible. Kittens were born with holes in their hearts. Immune systems were collapsing. A parasite that a healthy cougar would shrug off in a week was killing Florida panthers in days. The population wasn't just small. It was genetically poisoned. Every panther alive was so closely related to every other panther that mating was essentially the biological equivalent of shuffling the same broken deck of cards over and over again. Each generation came out worse than the one before. So the state of Florida, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and a team of wildlife geneticists made a decision that had never been tried before with a large predator on American soil. They were going to capture 8 female Texas cougars, truck them across the Gulf Coast, and release them into the Everglades to breed with the remaining Florida males. The idea was simple. The execution was anything but. And what happened over the next 3 decades rewrote the rules of conservation biology. If you find stories like this fascinating, the ones where science gambles everything on a plan that sounds half crazy and somehow pulls it off, then subscribe. Every week we dig into the stories behind the decisions that shaped the natural world and the people who had the guts to make them. To understand why Florida's panthers were in such desperate shape by the mid-90s, you need to understand what happened to them over the previous 200 years. The Florida panther is not a separate species. It's a subspecies of the cougar, the same animal that once ranged from the tip of South America to the Canadian Yukon. In North America alone, cougars occupied almost every habitat type imaginable, from deserts to mountains to swamps to prairies. They were the most widely distributed large mammal in the Western Hemisphere. But starting in the 1600s, European colonists began killing them, and they didn't stop for 300 years. The reasons were always the same. Cougars killed livestock. Cougars threatened children. Cougars competed with hunters for deer and elk. State governments put bounties on their heads. A dead cougar was worth cash, and plenty of frontier families supplemented their income by bringing in pelts and skulls. In some states, the bounty system ran for over a century. In the eastern United States, the extermination was nearly total. By 1900, cougars had been wiped out from every state east of the Mississippi River except one, Florida. And even there, the population had been hammered so hard that by the 1950s, many biologists believed the Florida panther was already extinct. Hunters with hounds had pursued them into the deepest swamps. Farmers had shot them on sight. And as South Florida developed through the early 20th century, the habitat shrank year after year, pushing what was left of the population into smaller and more isolated pockets of wilderness. It wasn't, but it might as well have been. The surviving panthers had been pushed into the most remote, least desirable corner of South Florida, a patchwork of cypress swamps, sawgrass prairies, and hardwood hammocks south of Lake Okeechobee. This was not prime panther habitat. Panthers prefer upland forests with dense cover and abundant deer. What they got was mosquito-infested wetland that flooded for half the year. But it was the only place left where humans hadn't paved, plowed, or developed every square mile. So the panthers hung on. The problem was the population bottleneck. When a species gets squeezed down to a tiny number of individuals, something happens that geneticists call the founder effect. All future generations descend from that tiny group, and whatever genetic quirks, weaknesses, or mutations that group carries get amplified with every generation. For the Florida panther, the bottleneck happened sometime in the early 20th century, when the population probably dipped below 50 animals. From that point on, every panther born was increasingly related to every other panther. Fathers bred with daughters, brothers bred with sisters, not because the animals wanted to, because there was literally no one else. The consequences of inbreeding in big cats are brutal and well documented. The first thing to go is fertility. Sperm quality drops, litter sizes shrink, kitten survival rates plummet. Then the immune system starts to weaken. Diseases that a genetically healthy population would handle without issue become lethal. Heart defects appear. Skeletal abnormalities show up. The kinked tail that became a trademark of the Florida Panther wasn't a charming regional quirk. It was a visible symptom of genetic collapse. By the early 1990s, biologists studying the remaining panthers were documenting a horror show of genetic deterioration. 94% of males examined had at least one undescended testicle, a condition called cryptorchidism that dramatically reduces fertility. Sperm samples showed abnormality rates above 90%. Heart murmurs were found in a significant percentage of captured animals. Atrial septal defects, literal holes in the heart, were appearing in kittens. The panthers were also riddled with parasites and diseases at rates far higher than their western cousins. Feline leukemia virus had been detected. Chronic wasting conditions were prevalent. The animals were smaller, weaker, and less robust than Texas or western cougars of the same age. A population model built by geneticist Mark Lotz and his colleagues projected that without intervention, the Florida panther would be functionally extinct within 20 to 40 years. Not might be, would be. The math was that clear. So by 1994, the question wasn't whether to do something. It was what to do, and whether anyone had the nerve to actually do it. The idea of genetic rescue, introducing individuals from a related population to restore genetic diversity, wasn't new in theory. It had been done with small mammals, with plants, with insects, but it had never been attempted with a large, solitary, territorial predator in the wild. The scientific arguments in favor were compelling. Texas cougars and Florida panthers were the same species. They had been a single interbreeding population as recently as 200 years ago, before human development severed the connection. Genetically, the distance between them was small enough that hybridization wouldn't create something new. It would restore something old, the genetic diversity that the Florida population had lost through isolation. But the arguments against were just as loud, and in some cases, louder. Purists in the conservation community were horrified. The Florida panther had been classified as a distinct subspecies, Puma concolor. Introducing Texas cougars, classified as Puma concolor stanleyana, would contaminate the subspecies. The offspring wouldn't be pure Florida panthers anymore. They would be hybrids, and hybrids didn't deserve Endangered Species Act protection. This argument sounds absurd in hindsight, and it was absurd at the time, but it carried real political weight. The Endangered Species Act, as written, protects listed species and subspecies. If the Florida panther was no longer a pure subspecies because it had been interbred with Texas stock, there was a legal argument that it would lose its protected status. And if it lost its protected status, the land protections that kept developers from paving over the last panther habitat in South Florida could evaporate overnight. The politics were toxic. Real estate developers in South Florida saw the panther as the single biggest obstacle to building on millions of acres of undeveloped land. Some of them had been quietly funding efforts to have the panther delisted for years. The last thing the conservation community wanted to do was hand them a legal argument on a silver platter. Then there were the ranchers. South Florida's cattle ranchers had an uneasy coexistence with panthers that went back generations. The cats occasionally killed calves, particularly during calving season when newborns were vulnerable, and the ranchers occasionally killed cats. It was illegal under the Endangered Species Act, and the fines were severe. But in the vast open rangelands of Hendry and Collier counties, enforcement was practically impossible. A dead panther buried in a pasture left no evidence and no witnesses. Introducing more cats, even if they were technically different cats, was going to go over about as well as you'd expect. Several ranching families publicly opposed the plan at public hearings, arguing that they were already losing calves and couldn't afford to lose more. And then there was the public. Most Floridians didn't even know there were panthers in their state. The ones who did were split between people who wanted to save them and people who considered them dangerous predators that should be eliminated. Into this mess walked a group of scientists who decided that the genetics didn't care about politics, and neither did extinction. The key figure was David Mayer, a wildlife biologist who had been tracking Florida panthers with radio collars since the mid-1980s. Mayer knew the population better than anyone alive. He had captured and collared dozens of animals, tracked their movements, documented their breeding, and watched them die. He had held dead kittens in his hands and read the necropsy reports that detailed heart defects and immune system failures that shouldn't exist in a healthy population. Mayer was joined by Melody Rolke, a veterinarian and geneticist who had been collecting blood and tissue samples from Florida panthers for years. Rolke's lab work had produced the hard numbers on sperm abnormalities, genetic diversity metrics, and disease prevalence that made the case for intervention impossible to ignore. Together, with support from the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, they developed the Genetic Restoration Plan. The core idea was straightforward: capture 8 female Texas cougars from the population in the dry brushlands of South Texas. Transport them to South Florida. Release them into the territory of existing male Florida panthers. Let nature take its course. The choice of 8 was deliberate. Population genetics models showed that even a small infusion of new genes could have a dramatic effect on a bottlenecked population, but the number had to be large enough to ensure that at least some of the introduced females would successfully breed. 8 was the minimum that gave the models a high probability of success. The choice of females was also deliberate. Introducing males would have been faster in theory, since one male can breed with multiple females, but it would have been a disaster in practice. Male cougars are fiercely territorial. Introducing a strange male into an existing male's territory would almost certainly result in a fight, possibly a fatal one. The existing Florida males were too few and too valuable to risk. Females, on the other hand, are more tolerant of overlapping ranges and more likely to be accepted, or at least not killed, by resident males. The bet was that the Florida males, desperate for mates, would breed with the Texas females rather than fight them. In 1995, the captures began. Wildlife officers in South Texas, working with trained hound dogs and helicopter spotters, tracked and tranquilized 8 female Texas cougars over a period of several weeks in the dry brushlands between Laredo and Corpus Christi. Each animal was given a thorough health screening, blood drawn, teeth checked, weight recorded, fitted with a radio collar that would transmit location data via satellite, and transported by vehicle across the Gulf Coast to South Florida. The journey took roughly 18 hours per animal, and each cougar traveled in a specially designed crate with ventilation and padding to minimize stress. The logistics alone were a nightmare. You can't just throw a sedated mountain lion in the back of a pickup truck and drive for a day and a half. The animals had to be monitored constantly. Veterinarians rode with each transport to check vital signs. Stops were scheduled for hydration. The sedation had to be carefully calibrated, enough to keep the animal calm, but not so much that it suppressed breathing during the long drive. The releases were staggered across several locations in the Big Cypress National Preserve and the Fakahatchee Strand Preserve State Park, 2 of the largest remaining blocks of panther habitat. Each female was released at a different point, sometimes miles apart. The idea was to spread the Texas females across the landscape so they would encounter different Florida males, maximizing the genetic mixing, and then everyone held their breath. The first few months were tense. Radio collar data showed that the Texas females were moving through the landscape, which was a good sign, but nobody knew whether the Florida males would accept them. Cougar courtship is not a gentle affair. The male tracks the female, sometimes for days. There's hissing, growling, swatting. The female has to be in estrus and has to accept the male, or she'll fight him off. One by one, the collar data started showing what the scientists had hoped for. The Texas females were pairing up with Florida males. Breeding was happening. The first litter of hybrid kittens was born in early 1996. When the biologists managed to capture and examine them, the results were immediate and dramatic. The kittens were bigger than pure Florida panther kittens. Their hearts were normal. No septal defects. No kinked tails. Their coats were glossier, their bone structure was denser, and when the veterinarians drew blood, the lab work came back looking like it belonged to a completely different population. Immune markers were stronger. Parasite loads were lower. These kittens had gotten a genetic reset that their parents never had. The males, when they matured, had normal descended testicles and sperm that looked, for the first time in anyone's memory, like healthy cougar sperm. Melody Rolka, who had spent years documenting the grotesque sperm abnormalities of inbred Florida males, described looking at the first hybrid sperm sample under a microscope and feeling like she was seeing a different species. Normal morphology, normal motility. The contrast with the samples she had been collecting for the past decade was staggering. But one litter doesn't save a subspecies. The real question was whether the genetic rescue would scale, whether the new genes would spread through the population fast enough to outrun the ongoing decline. Over the next 5 years, the answer became increasingly clear. It was working. By the year 2000, the proportion of kittens born with heart defects had dropped from around 70% to less than 10%. Cryptorchidism rates went from 94% to less than 40%. Kitten survival rates, the most critical number for population growth, more than doubled. The Panthers didn't just get healthier, they got bigger, faster, and more resilient. Hybrid animals were consistently larger than pure Florida Panthers and showed greater disease resistance. Their immune systems were stronger. They survived injuries and infections that would have killed their inbred predecessors. The population responded. From a low of 20 to 30 animals in 1995, the panther count began to climb, slowly at first. 35 by 1998, 50 by 2001, 70 by 2005. Then something unexpected happened. The population didn't just grow, it expanded geographically. For decades, Florida panthers had been confined to a single population south of the Caloosahatchee River, a narrow waterway that cuts across the state and had become an effective barrier to northward dispersal. Panthers had occasionally been spotted north of the river, but none had established permanent territories there. Starting around 2007, that changed. Young male panthers, stronger and healthier than any generation before them, began crossing the Caloosahatchee. They swam it, walked across low water points, and in at least one documented case, used a bridge underpass to get to the other side. They showed up in places where panthers hadn't been seen in decades. Central Florida, the Ocala National Forest, properties north of Orlando. A trail camera in 2017 captured an image of a male panther in Highlands County, over 100 miles from the nearest known breeding territory. Ranchers who hadn't seen a panther track in their lifetimes were suddenly finding them in their pastures. The geographic expansion was a sign of success, but it brought new problems. North of the Caloosahatchee, the landscape is very different from the swamps and preserves of South Florida. It's ranch land, subdivisions, strip malls, highways. Interstate 75 alone, the highway that cuts through the heart of what should be panther habitat, was killing panthers at a rate that threatened to offset the population gains from the genetic rescue. Vehicle strikes became the leading cause of death for Florida panthers. In some years, more than 20 panthers were killed by cars. Each dead panther represented not just an individual animal, but a portion of the genetic diversity that had been so painstakingly restored. The state's response was to build wildlife crossings, underpasses and overpasses designed specifically for large animals. These had been used successfully in other parts of the world, particularly in Banff National Park in Canada, where highway crossings for grizzly bears and elk had dramatically reduced roadkill. Florida began installing these crossings along key highway corridors in the late 1990s and has continued building them ever since. Along a 40-mile stretch of Interstate 75 known as Alligator Alley, which cuts directly through the Everglades and Big Cypress, the state built a series of underpasses combined with 8-foot-high fencing that funnels wildlife toward the crossing points. The fencing alone cost millions, and each underpass had to be wide enough and tall enough that a panther, an animal that spooks easily in enclosed spaces, would feel comfortable walking through it. The crossings work. Camera trap data shows panthers, bears, deer, and other wildlife using the underpasses regularly. In areas where crossings have been installed, panther roadkill rates have dropped significantly. One crossing on State Road 29 inches, Collier County recorded over 200 panther passages in a single year. But there are only so many crossings, and the highway network keeps expanding. Every new road through panther country creates another gauntlet that the animals have to navigate. By 2020, the Florida panther population was estimated at between 120 and 230 animals. The wide range reflects the difficulty of counting solitary, secretive predators in dense vegetation. Some biologists put the number closer to 200. Others are more conservative. Either way, the trajectory is unmistakable. From 20-something animals in 1995 to somewhere north of 120 inches 2020, the Florida panther population has increased by at least fourfold, and the genetic health indicators continue to improve with each generation. The 8 Texas Cougars that were released in 1995 didn't all survive. Some were killed by vehicles, some died of natural causes. A couple were eventually recaptured and removed after they wandered into areas where conflicts with humans or livestock became unmanageable. But the genes they introduced are now permanently embedded in the Florida panther population. Every panther alive today carries some Texas DNA. And that brings us to the question that the purists raised back in the early 1990s. Is the animal that lives in South Florida today still a Florida panther? The answer depends on what you think a Florida panther is. If you define it as a genetically distinct subspecies with no admixture from other cougar populations, then no. The Florida panther as a pure subspecies no longer exists. The introduction of Texas genes ended that. But if you define the Florida panther as a population of cougars adapted to life in the subtropical habitats of the southeastern United States, descended from the cats that survived the great extermination of the 19th and 20th centuries, and carrying the genetic heritage of both the original Florida population and its Texas reinforcements, then yes, the Florida panther is very much alive. Most modern conservation biologists side with the second definition, and the reason is pragmatic. The pure Florida panther was going extinct. The genetic rescue saved a population by restoring diversity that human actions had removed. Insisting on subspecies purity when the subspecies is dying is, as one geneticist put it, arguing about the color of the curtains while the house is on fire. The Endangered Species Act protection has held. Courts have consistently ruled that the Florida panther remains a protected subspecies regardless of the Texas gene infusion, because the intent of the act is to preserve populations and their ecosystems, not to maintain arbitrary genetic boundaries. But the Florida panther's survival is far from guaranteed. The biggest threat today isn't genetics, it's habitat. South Florida is one of the fastest growing regions in the United States. The population of the state has doubled since 1990, and most of that growth has been concentrated in the coastal areas of Central and South Florida, directly adjacent to panther habitat. Every new housing development, every new highway interchange, every new shopping center eats into the land that panthers need to survive. The math is simple. A breeding female panther needs a home range of roughly 70 to 200 square miles. A breeding male needs 200 to 500 square miles. With a population of 120 to 230 animals, the panthers need tens of thousands of square miles of connected habitat. What they have is a shrinking patchwork of preserves, ranches, and public lands that is being cut into smaller and smaller pieces by development. Connectivity is the critical issue. Panthers don't live in parks. They live across landscapes. A male might cross 3 counties in a week if his path is blocked by a highway with no crossing, a subdivision with no wildlife corridor, or a canal with no bridge. He can't reach breeding females, and the population fragmentation is the slow-motion version of what nearly killed the panthers in the first place. When populations get cut off from each other, they lose genetic diversity. Inbreeding returns. The death spiral starts again. Conservation organizations are fighting this on multiple fronts. Land acquisition programs have protected hundreds of thousands of acres in South Florida, Wildlife corridors are being mapped and, in some cases, legally designated. Ranch conservation easements pay private landowners to keep their land as open habitat instead of selling to developers. But the pressure is relentless. Florida added over 300,000 new residents per year over the past decade. Each of those people needs a place to live, a road to drive on, a store to shop at. And much of the land that's cheapest and easiest to develop sits right in the middle of Panther country. There's also climate change to contend with. South Florida is uniquely vulnerable to sea level rise. As saltwater intrudes into the coastal Everglades, it pushes wildlife, including panthers, inland and northward. But inland and northward is where the people are. The panthers are being squeezed between rising seas on one side and rising human population on the other. The irony is painful. The genetic rescue was designed to give the panther population enough health and vigor to grow. And it worked. But growth requires space. A panther population of 200 needs roughly 4 times the habitat of a population of 50. And the habitat isn't growing, it's shrinking. Some biologists have begun talking about what they call the second genetic rescue. Not because the first one failed, but because the first one solved a genetic problem without solving the habitat problem. Even with healthy genes, a population that can't expand, that keeps getting compressed into smaller and smaller spaces, will eventually hit the same wall. The difference is that this time, the wall isn't genetic, it's political and economic. Saving the panther's genes was a scientific challenge. Saving the panther's habitat is a social one. And social challenges, as anyone who has tried to build a wildlife crossing through a development zone knows, are harder than science. What the Florida panther story proves, more clearly than almost any other case in conservation history, is that extinction isn't a single event. It's a process, and at every stage of that process, there are intervention points where the right decision, made by the right people at the right time, can bend the trajectory. In the 1990s, the intervention point was genetics. A small team of scientists, facing opposition from purists, politicians, and developers, made the call to introduce Texas Cougars. It was controversial. It was risky. It violated the prevailing orthodoxy about subspecies purity, and it saved the Florida panther from functional extinction. Today, the intervention point is habitat, and the decisions being made right now about land use, highway design, corridor protection, and development boundaries will determine whether the panther population that was rescued from genetic collapse has a landscape big enough to survive in. The 8 Texas Cougars that crossed the state line in 1995 didn't know they were making history. They were cats, doing what cats do, finding territory, finding mates, producing kittens. But those kittens, and their kittens, and the generations that followed, changed the genetic trajectory of an entire subspecies. From 20 animals on the edge of extinction to over 120 and counting. From 94% cryptorchidism to near-normal reproductive health. From a population confined to a single pocket of swamp to one that's pushing north into new territory for the first time in a century. The Florida panther is alive today because a group of scientists had the audacity to ask a question that sounded absurd. What if we just brought in some new cats? And the answer turned out to be the most successful genetic rescue of a large predator ever attempted. The story isn't over. It won't be over for decades. But every panther track pressed into the mud of a cypress swamp, every kitten born with a healthy heart, every male that crosses a highway underpass and lives to breed on the other side, is proof that sometimes the craziest idea in the room is the one that works. If you want to see another story about a species that came back from the edge, the video on screen right now covers one that's just as wild. Click it, and I'll see you there.